The apartment was quiet, except for the sound of the clock ticking on the wall. It was a small sound, but to Julian, it was loud. He sat on the edge of his bed, his hands resting on his knees. He could not see the room, but he knew it by heart. He knew the scratchy feeling of the wool blanket under his hands. He knew the smell of old wood and dust that hung in the air. He knew exactly how many steps it took to get from his bed to the window. 5 steps. No more, no less. Julian had been blind for 10 years. At first, the darkness had felt like a heavy weight that pressed down on his chest, making it hard to breathe. He used to bump into corners and trip over rugs, angry at the world and angry at himself. But time changes things, even if you cannot see the time passing. Slowly, his ears learned to do what his eyes could not. He started to hear the difference between the silence of an empty room and the silence of a room, where someone was holding their breath. He could hear the mood in a person's voice before they even spoke a full sentence. But lately, the world outside his window had changed. The city of Warsaw was no longer the place he remembered. The air that came through the cracks in the window didn't smell like fresh bread and coffee anymore. It smelled like smoke and cold metal. The streets, which used to echo with the chatter of neighbors and the laughter of children, were now filled with the heavy, terrifying sound of marching boots. Soldiers were everywhere. They walked with a rhythm that made Julian's stomach tighten. Every time he heard it, the war had taken away the noise of life and replaced it with the noise of fear. Julian stood up and walked the 5 steps to the window. He placed his hand on the cold glass. He couldn't see the gray sky or the buildings across the street, but he could feel the vibration of the trucks passing by below. Big, ugly trucks that carried men with guns. He felt helpless. He was just one man, a musician who couldn't even see the sheet music in front of him. What could he possibly do against an army? His sister Alara was the only family he had left. Their parents had passed away years ago. Alara took care of him, but she was also busy. She spent her days running around the city, trying to find food, trying to keep them alive. She never said exactly what she was doing, but Julian could hear the tension in her voice when she came home at night. She smelled like cold air and exhaustion. She would hug him, her hands shaking a little, and tell him everything was fine. But Julian knew it won. Afternoon, there was a heavy knock at the door. It wasn't Alara's soft knock. It was hard, demanding. Julian felt a spike of fear. He walked to the door and opened it slowly. Julian. A deep voice asked. Yes, Julian answered, gripping the doorknob tight. I am Captain Kessler, the man said. His voice was smooth, with an accent that was hard and sharp. I am told you play the piano. Julian froze. He knew that voice. He had heard officers shouting in the street, but this one was calm.
I do.
But I do not play for audiences anymore. We have heard about you, Kessler said, ignoring him. They say you have a gift, that you can play anything from memory. I enjoy music. It makes me feel civilized, even in this place. We have taken over the community hall down the street. My men are bored. We need someone to play for us on Friday evenings. Julian didn't know what to say. If he refused, would they arrest him? Would they hurt Alara? I am just a simple man, Julian stammered. Good, Kessler said, sounding pleased. Come at 8 o'clock this Friday. Do not be late. The heavy footsteps walked away, fading down the hall. Julian closed the door and leaned his forehead against the wood. His heart was beating so hard he could hear it in his ears. Play for them. For the men who were destroying his city? The thought made him feel sick. But he was scared. They had guns. They had power. He had nothing but his hands and his old piano. When Alara came home that evening, Julian told her what happened. He expected her to tell him to run or to hide. Instead, she went very quiet. You have to go, she said softly. Alara, I cannot play for them, Julian said, turning his face toward where he knew she was sitting. I can't. Julian, listen to me, she said, and her voice had a strange, hard edge to it. They don't think of you as a threat. To them, you are a helpless blind man. They see your cane, your dark glasses, and they think you are harmless, Because you are harmless, right? Yes, Julian whispered. I am no soldier. Exactly, she said. That is why you must go. You need to be where they are. You need to be in that room. Please, Julian. Just do it. He didn't understand why she was pushing him, but he trusted her. She was his eyes in a world he couldn't see. Friday came too quickly. The air was freezing. Julian dressed in his best suit, the one he hadn't worn since before the war started. He picked up his white cane and stepped out of the apartment. The walk to the community hall was terrifying. The streets were dark, and the sound of boots crunching on gravel made him flinch. He kept his head down, counting his steps, focusing on the tap of his cane on the pavement. When he arrived at the hall, the smell hit him first. It was a mix of strong tobacco, cheap liquor, and gun oil. The noise was loud. Men were laughing, speaking in a language Julian didn't understand. He felt a hand grab his arm roughly. This is the musician. A voice sneered. Let go of me, Julian said, trying to sound braver than he felt. The hand let go, and someone shoved him toward the stage. Go on, blind man. Play something nice. Julian walked carefully up the stairs. He found the piano bench with his legs and sat down. He reached out, and his fingers touched the cold ivory keys. It was an old instrument, a little out of tune, but it felt like home. He took a deep breath and tried to block out the noise. He tried to forget that the room was full of enemies. He started to play. He chose a piece by Chopin, a sad and beautiful nocturne. As the music filled the air, the room began to quiet down. The laughter stopped. Julian let his fingers fly over the keys. He poured all his fear, his anger, and his sadness into the music. He played about the dark streets, the hunger, and the fear that lived inside every apartment in the city. He played until his fingers hurt. When he finished, there was a moment of total silence. Julian sat there, his chest heaving, waiting for them to laugh or throw things. Then, the sound of one person clapping. Slow, heavy claps. Bravo, Captain Kessler said from somewhere in the front. Bravo. You see, men, even in this fallen city, there is a little bit of culture left. The others started clapping too, though it sounded polite rather than real. They were just following their leader. Julian stood up and bowed. He felt dizzy. He had survived the first night, but as he stood there, listening to the sounds of the enemy relaxing, listening to the clinking of glasses and the low rumble of voices, he realized something important. They weren't looking at him. They were looking at their drinks. They were talking loudly, thinking he was just a background decoration, a blind servant who provided music. They were talking about troop movements, about inspections, about cleaning up the districts. Julian kept his head down. He walked toward the sound of the door, his cane tapping on the wooden floor. Good night, Captain, he said meekly. See you next week, Julian, Kessler said, as Julian walked out into the cold night air. His heart was pounding for a different reason now. He realized Alara was right. They thought he was invisible. They thought because he couldn't see them, he couldn't hear them, but his hearing was perfect. He had heard Kessler talking about a train schedule. He had heard coordinates being mentioned over the noise of the room. He walked home through the dark, his mind racing. He wasn't just a piano player anymore. He was a spy who didn't need eyes. He was a man sitting at a table full of wolves, pretending to be a sheep. And the wolves had no idea that the sheep was memorizing their secrets. For the first time in years, Julian didn't feel helpless. He felt a dangerous spark of hope ignite in his chest. He had to go back. He had to listen. And somehow he had to find a way to tell Alara what he knew. The walk home from the community hall felt different that night. The cold air still stung Julian's face, and the sound of distant boots still made his stomach turn, but there was a new rhythm to his thoughts. He wasn't just a blind man trying to survive anymore. He was a vessel carrying something dangerous. His mind kept replaying the fragments of conversation he had heard while playing. Words like Tuesday, North Bridge, and cargo floated around in his head. He knew these weren't just random words. They were pieces of a puzzle that the resistance needed to solve. When he unlocked the door to his apartment, the smell of soup greeted him. It was a thin, watery smell, but it was warm. Ilara was sitting at the small table, her hands wrapped around a mug. She looked up as he tapped his cane into the room. "You played," she said quietly. It wasn't a question. "I did," Julian said, hanging his coat on the hook by the door. He walked to the table and sat down. They listened. They drank. They talked. Ilara put her mug down. Julian could hear the leather of her jacket creak as she leaned in close. What did they say? Julian closed his eyes, even though it made no difference to the darkness he always saw. He focused his memory on the sounds from the hall. He remembered the deep voice of Captain Kessler, cutting through the music. They were talking about a transport. Julian began slowly. Next Tuesday. Kessler said they are moving heavy equipment to the North Bridge. He said they start loading at dawn. Ilara let out a breath that sounded like a hiss. The North Bridge. That's where our supply line is. If they put heavy equipment there, they can cut off the whole district. Julian nodded. He also mentioned a code word. Redstone. I don't know what it means, but he said it twice. Ilara stood up and began pacing the small room. Julian tracked her movement by the sound of her soft shoes on the floorboards. Back and forth. Back and forth. Julian, this is huge, but we have a problem. How do I tell them? I can't just walk into a meeting and say, my brother heard the captain talking. They will ask where you got the info. If they think you are close to the captain, it puts a target on your back. And if the captain finds out you are a spy... She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. Julian knew the price of being a spy. So I tell you, and you tell them anonymously, Julian suggested. It's not enough, she said, stopping her pacing. It takes too long, and information gets old fast. By the time the message gets through the network, the trucks might be gone. We need a faster way. A direct way. Julian sat in silence for a long time. He thought about the piano. He thought about the way the men ignored him, treating him like a piece of furniture. He thought about the music. Music was a language. It had structure. It had patterns. I can play it to them, Julian said suddenly. Ilara stopped pacing. What? I can play it to the network, Julian said, his voice growing stronger. You have people listening, don't you? People in the city who are watching? Maybe I can play on the radio? Or maybe I can play in the square. No, they wouldn't let me. Think Julian, Ilara urged him. You play at the hall every week now. Who is at the hall? The soldiers. The officers. Exactly, she said. And who cleans the hall? Who serves the drinks? Who works in the kitchen? Julian's eyes widened behind his dark glasses. The locals. Yes, Ilara said excitedly. Resistance workers are everywhere. They are cleaning the floors. They are pouring the wine. They are listening. But they can't take notes, and they can't whisper to each other. But they can hear music. Julian turned his face toward the piano in the corner of the living room. It was an old upright, slightly out of tune, but he loved it. He stood up and walked over to it. He sat on the bench and placed his fingers on the keys. I need a code, he murmured. A simple one, Ilara said, coming to stand behind him. Something that fits into the music naturally. Soldiers like loud, dramatic music. They won't notice if I play a wrong note or if I repeat a phrase too many times. They will think it is just my style. Julian started to play a simple scale. C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. Notes are letters, he said. A, B, C, D, E, F, G. That gives me 7 letters. I can add the octave for H and I, but J is hard. Don't use letters, Ilara suggested. Use positions. Use numbers. Numbers are safer. 1 note means 1, 2 notes mean 2. No, that's too slow, Julian said. I need to tell a whole story in one song. He thought about the way classical music was built. It had chords. It had keys. Major keys for yes, minor keys for no, he tested. He played a bright C major chord. It sounded happy. Yes. Then he played a C minor chord. It sounded dark and sad. No, Good, Elara said. What about the bridge? Modulation, Julian said instantly. If I change the key in the middle of the piece, that could be the location. A shift to G major could mean the North District. A shift to D major could mean the South, and the time. Elara asked. The rhythm, Julian said, tapping his foot. I can use the tempo. Fast means morning. Slow means night. Or I can use repeats. If I play the first section 3 times instead of 2, that means the 3rd hour of the day. 3 o'clock. Julian's mind was racing faster than his fingers ever could. It was brilliant, but it was terrifying. He had to compose music that sounded beautiful and normal, but secretly held a map and a timetable inside it. One mistake in the resistance would walk into a trap. One suspicion from the soldiers, and he would be dead. Let's try it, Elara said firmly. Pretend I am a cleaner in the back of the room. I am holding a tray, looking bored. Tell me about the trucks on Tuesday. Tell me it is at 3 o'clock at the North Bridge. Play it. Julian took a deep breath. He cracked his knuckles. He closed his eyes and let his hands hover over the keys. He started to play a melody he knew well, a popular waltz that the soldiers liked. It was light and catchy. He played it straight through the first time. Then, he began to weave in the code. He wanted to say north, so in the middle of the waltz. He abruptly shifted the melody into the key of G. It sounded a bit strange, a jarring contrast to the lightness of the waltz. But it sounded artistic, like a sudden change of mood. Next, he needed to say 3. He played a small trill 3 rapid notes on the high C. It sparkled like a bell. Finally, he needed to say trucks. For this, he played a heavy, loud chord sequence in the bass with his left hand. Thump, thump. He finished the piece and lifted his hands, waiting. Elara was silent for a moment. Julian held his breath. North, she said slowly. The shift in key felt like a change of direction, like looking up. The trill was definitely a number, a count, 3, in the heavy bass. Those were heavy objects. Trucks. Julian let out a long exhale he felt he had been holding for days. It works. It works, she agreed, her voice trembling slightly. Julian, this is dangerous. If you make a mistake, I won't, Julian said, cutting her off. He felt a strange calm settle over him. For years he had felt like a burden, a man who needed help to cross the street. But now his blindness was his shield, and his music was his sword. They saw a helpless man playing tunes. They would never see the weapon he was becoming. We have to practice, Julian said. We need a full dictionary of codes. We need to map out the districts, the times, the unit types. We have to be ready for Friday. For the next 3 days, the apartment turned into a command center. Elara drew maps on paper, describing them to Julian in detail so he could visualize the sectors of the city. Julian sat at the piano for hours, figuring out how to turn the map into music. He assigned a specific musical phrase to each major unit of soldiers. He assigned rhythmic patterns to different types of cargo weapons, food, prisoners. It was exhausting work. His fingers would cramp up, and his head would spin with the patterns. But every time he felt like giving up, he would hear the sound of a truck rumbling past the window outside. And he would remember why he was doing this. On Friday night, Julian dressed in his suit again. He felt the weight of the code in his pocket, a small slip of paper Elara had written for him, just in case his memory failed. He didn't need to look at it, though. The music was burned into his mind now. He walked to the community hall. The air was colder than ever. When he arrived, the hall was rowdy. It seemed like there were more soldiers than usual. The tension in the air was thick, like static electricity before a storm. Julian walked onto the stage. He found his bench. He sat down. He could hear Captain Kessler, sitting near the front, talking loudly about the success of the occupation. "Play for us, blind man." Someone shouted from the back. "Play something to wake us up." Julian bowed his head. He placed his hands on the keys. He didn't start with a gentle tune tonight. He started with a thunderous chord. It was the signal for urgent. The room went quiet. he began to play. It was a chaotic, stormy piece of music. He wove the message into the sound. Tuesday, North Bridge, dawn. Heavy weapons. He played the code with precision, making sure the dissonance was just right, strange enough to be noticed by those who knew what to listen for, but subtle enough to be dismissed as modern art by the drunk soldiers in the audience. Out of the corner of his eye, or rather, out of the edge of his hearing, he noticed something. In the back of the room, near the kitchen doors, the clinking of glasses had stopped. A woman was standing there, a cleaning rag in her hand. She was standing perfectly still, her head cocked to the side. She was listening. Julian played the final sequence, the confirmation code. He held the last chord, letting the silence ring out in the hall. The cleaning woman moved. She didn't cheer. She didn't clap. She simply dropped her rag and walked quickly out the back door. She had her orders. The soldiers burst into applause. Wonderful. Captain Kessler roared. Very dramatic. Julian stood up and bowed. He was sweating, but he felt a warmth inside him that had nothing to do with the stage lights. The message was sent. The resistance would know. They would be ready at the North Bridge on Tuesday. He had done it. He had used his music to fight back. As he walked off the stage, passing the rows of men in uniform, he realized they were clapping for the very thing that was going to destroy them. They were applauding their own defeat, and they didn't even know it. Julian smiled a small, secret smile. He was no longer just a pianist. He was the voice of the resistance. The winter had settled over the city like a heavy gray blanket. The snow didn't just fall. It seemed to suffocate the streets, piling up against the doors and covering the windows with a thick layer of frost. Inside the apartment, the cold was a living thing. It crept through the cracks in the walls and bit at Julian's fingers. He wrapped his trembling hands in a thick wool scarf, but it did little to stop the chill. For a pianist, the cold was the enemy. It made his fingers stiff and slow. It turned his hands into clumsy claws that couldn't feel the delicate vibrations of the strings. But the work had to go on. Since the first successful message, resistance had relied on Julian completely. What started as a few simple signals about troop movements had grown into something much bigger. Now, every Friday night, Julian was expected to deliver a full report. It wasn't just about a single truck or a bridge anymore. The resistance was planning something bigger, coordinated operation to strike back against the occupiers. They needed detailed information, and they needed it all at once. Julian sat at the kitchen table with Alara. She was whispering to him, her voice low and urgent, listing the things the resistance needed to know. They need the patrol routes for Sector 4, she said. They need to know which trains are carrying ammunition and which are carrying food. They need to know the shift change times at the main gate. Julian, they need 50 separate pieces of information, all in one night. Julian felt a knot tighten in his stomach. 50, he asked. Alara, that is impossible. I can't put 50 messages into one song. It would sound like noise. The captain would notice. He is smart. Has to be done, she said, reaching out and grabbing his cold hand. People are counting on you. If we don't get this information out, the operation will fail. Good people will die. Julian pulled his hand away and stood up. He walked over to the window. He couldn't see the snow, but he could feel the draft coming from the glass. He felt the weight of the city pressing down on him. He was tired. He was so tired of being afraid. He was tired of sitting in a room full of monsters, smiling while they drank wine and talked about murder. And now, they wanted him to weave a tapestry of 50 secrets into the music. It was too much pressure. I am not a machine, Alara, he said softly. I am just a blind man who plays the piano. You are more than that, she said fiercely. You are the only one who can do this, please. He stood there for a long time, listening to the silence of the apartment. Finally, he nodded. Okay, but we have to change the code. I can't use simple phrases anymore. I need to compress the information. They spent the next 2 days working without stopping. Julian's mind was working faster than it ever had before. He decided to use chords to represent complex ideas. Instead of playing a phrase for truck, he would play a specific chord for vehicle. if he played it loudly. It meant heavy vehicle. If he played it softly, it meant light vehicle. He used rhythm to indicate speed and timing. He used the high notes for the north and the low notes for the south. It was a complex language, a hidden dictionary that only he and Alara knew. He practiced until his fingers bled. He played until his vision swam with flashing colors of light that weren't there. He had to memorize the entire sequence of 50 messages perfectly. There was no room for error. If he played the wrong chord, the resistance might think a train was full of food when it was actually full of soldiers. Friday night arrived. The wind was howling outside, rattling the window panes. Julian, dressed in his heavy coat, he felt like he was walking to his own execution. When he arrived at the community hall, the atmosphere was different. The soldiers were rowdier than usual. There was a tension in the air, a feeling that something was about to snap. Julian walked onto the stage. The piano felt cold, like ice. He sat down and adjusted the bench. Captain Kessler was sitting in the front row, as usual. But tonight, there was someone else sitting next to him. A younger officer. Julian could hear the distinctive click of heels and the sharp, impatient tapping of a finger on a table. "Play something with energy tonight, pianist," the young officer shouted. His voice was arrogant, cutting through the noise of the room. "We are bored of the sad songs." Julian took a deep breath. He closed his eyes. He began to play. The piece he had composed was a masterpiece of deception. To the untrained ear, it sounded like a wild, stormy symphony. It was full of crashing chords and rapid runs. It was exciting and dramatic. But underneath the noise, the code was flowing. Patrol change at 6 o'clock. He played a fast scale in the right hand. Sector 4 is clear. He struck a major chord in the bass, train carrying ammunition arriving at midnight. He played a dissonant, metallic clash of notes, one by one. The messages went out. He counted them in his head as he played. 5, 10, 20, 30. His fingers were flying across the keys. The sweat was pouring down his face, stinging his eyes. He was terrified of making a mistake. He was terrified of losing count. He reached message number 40. Heavy guard unit at the south gate. He played a heavy, thumping rhythm in the left hand. Then disaster struck. He was in the middle of message 42 when his left little finger slipped on the sweat. It hit the wrong key. A sharp, jarring note rang out that didn't belong to the music. It was a mistake that ruined the flow. It ruined the code. The room went silent. Julian's heart stopped. He froze. He knew what that wrong note meant. In the code, that specific phrase meant abort. It was the opposite of what he wanted to say. If the resistance heard that, they would cancel the whole operation. The soldiers guarding the gate would not be attacked. The train carrying ammunition would get through. People would die for nothing. He couldn't fix it by just playing the right note. The code listeners would have already heard the abort signal. He had to correct it immediately. He had to tell them that the previous message was false, that they should ignore it. But how could he do that without Captain Kessler noticing? Captain Kessler stood up. "Stop," he said. The music died. Julian sat there, his hands hovering over the keys, trembling. "That note," Kessler said, walking toward the stage. "That was ugly. You missed the melody. It sounded chaotic." I am sorry, Captain," Julian stammered. "My hands are cold. The piano is out of tune." "Fix it," Kessler ordered. "Play it again. Play that section properly." Julian's mind was racing. If he played the section again exactly as written, he would send the abort signal again. He had to change the music on the spot to correct the message. But Kessler was watching him closely now. He was listening for the melody. If Julian changed the music too much, Kessler would know something was wrong. Julian took a breath. He had to trust his training. He had to be smarter than them. "Of course, Captain," Julian said meekly. "I will play it with more feeling." He placed his hands back on the keys. He started the section again. But this time, he didn't play the correct melody. He played a variation. He took the abort signal, a falling minor scale, and he twisted it. He turned the sad minor scale into a rising major scale. In the code language they had built, a rising major scale meant error or correction. He followed the correction immediately with the true message for number 42. He played it loudly and clearly. To Kessler, it sounded like Julian was just improvising, fixing his mistake by adding a fancy little run of notes. It sounded artistic. It sounded like a pianist showing off. Kessler nodded his head. Much better, he said, sitting back down. Continue. Julian let out a silent breath of relief. He continued playing. He sent the remaining 8 messages. He played the final chord with a flourish and let the sound ring out in the hall. The soldiers applauded. They had no idea. They thought they had just heard a nice concert. But in the back of the room, a waiter wiping a table heard the error code and the correction. He finished his work and walked out into the snow. Julian stood up and bowed. He felt dizzy, his legs shaking under him. He had sent 50 messages. He had corrected a mistake right under the nose of the enemy. He had done the impossible. He walked out of the hall into the freezing night air. The snow was falling hard, muffling the sounds of the city. He couldn't see his way home, but he didn't care. He felt a surge of adrenaline unlike anything he had ever felt before. He was not just a survivor anymore. He was a warrior. He had fought with his music, and for tonight at least, he had won. He arrived back at the apartment, shivering and exhausted. Alara opened the door before he even knocked. She looked at his face and knew. "Did you get it all?" she whispered. Julian nodded slowly. He took off his coat and sat on the bed. "I sent it," he whispered. "All 50 messages? And the correction?" "They heard it," Julian said. "Tomorrow, the city fights." Asterisk, the week following the 50-message transmission was the longest of Julian's life. The city felt like it was holding its breath. Outside the window, the snow continued to fall, piling up against the buildings. But the usual sharp sounds of military boots and shouting seemed to have dulled into a tense, heavy silence. It was the kind of silence that comes before a storm. Julian stayed inside his apartment, his fingers hovering over his piano keys but not touching them. He was afraid to play. He felt that if he played a wrong note now, even here in the safety of his own home, it might somehow ruin everything. Every time he heard a car backfire in the distance, his heart jumped. He wondered if the resistance had succeeded. He wondered if the trains had been stopped. He wondered if his messages had been understood correctly. Ilara was out all day and most of the night. She came back only to sleep for a few hours, her face pale and drawn, her eyes rimmed with red exhaustion. She didn't tell Julian details. It was safer if he didn't know. If he was caught, he couldn't tell the soldiers what he didn't know. But her tight hugs and the way she squeezed his hand before leaving again told him that something big was happening. By Friday, the atmosphere in the city had changed completely. The heavy, brooding silence had been replaced by anger. The soldiers were furious. Julian could hear it in the way they marched through the streets now, not with the rhythmic pride of conquerors, but with the angry, heavy stomp of men who had been humiliated. When Julian arrived at the community hall that evening, he knew immediately that he was in danger. The air in the room smelled different. It didn't smell like tobacco and cheap booze anymore. It smelled like burned coffee and stress. As soon as he walked onto the stage, tapping his cane to find the piano bench, he felt the eyes of the room on him. Before, the soldiers had ignored him. He was just the blind man who made noise while they ate. Now they were watching him. He could feel their gaze like a physical weight on his skin. He sat down at the piano. But before he could play, a voice cut through the murmuring crowd. It wasn't Captain Kessler. It was the younger, sharper voice of the lieutenant who had sat next to him last week. "You play very strange music," the lieutenant said. His voice was close. He was standing right at the edge of the stage. Julian kept his hands in his lap. "I play what I feel, sir," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Do you?" The lieutenant laughed, but it was a cold, hard sound. "Or do you play what you are told to play?" "I compose my own pieces," Julian said. "I improvise." "Improvise," the lieutenant repeated. "That is a convenient word for making mistakes. Last week you played a section that was chaotic. My captain liked it. He thought it was art, but I know music. Blind man. I studied at the conservatory in Berlin before the war. And that little trick you did? That sudden shift from minor to major? It wasn't a correction. It was a signal. Julian felt the blood drain from his face. His heart began to hammer against his ribs so hard he thought the soldiers in the front row might hear it. He gripped the edge of the piano bench until his knuckles turned white. He had to think fast. "I'm sorry if my style offended you, sir," Julian said, bowing his head slightly. "I was trying to mimic the sound of the wind outside. I was cold. Don't lie to me." The lieutenant shouted. He marched up the stairs onto the stage. Julian heard his boots thumping heavily on the wood, coming closer. "We lost an entire train convoy because of a mistake in timing. We lost men because someone knew exactly when the guard change was. And the only information that went out of this room last week was your noise." The lieutenant grabbed Julian's shoulder. His grip was painful, like a vice. "You are a spy? And you are going to tell me who your contact is. Right now, take your hands off him." A deep, tired voice boomed from the front of the room. It was Captain Kessler. The lieutenant didn't let go. "Sir, he is sending codes. I am certain of it." "Nonsense," Kessler said, walking up the stage, step slowly. "He is blind, Hans. He cannot see our maps. He cannot see our written orders. He sits here and plays the piano. He is a harmless old man." "The music," the lieutenant insisted. "The patterns. Patterns are in the eye of the beholder," Kessler said wearily. Julian could hear the captain stopping right next to them. "You are tired, Hans. You are seeing enemies in the shadows. We lost the convoy because our own security is lax. Do not blame a musician because you are incompetent." The lieutenant's grip on Julian's shoulder loosened, then dropped. The air was thick with tension. "I am telling you, Captain," the lieutenant hissed. "His music is erratic. It changes too much. It is not natural." "Play," Kessler commanded Julian. "Play something normal. A simple waltz. Something that will calm my lieutenant down before he shoots you out of sheer stupidity." Julian's hands were shaking violently. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He was terrified. If he played now, the lieutenant would be analyzing every note, searching for a code. But if he refused, they might kill him right there. He placed his hands on the keys. He needed to play something incredibly simple. He needed to play something so boring, so traditional. Even the most paranoid officer would have to admit it was just music. He started to play a famous waltz. It was a piece everyone knew. It was light, fluffy, and predictable. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. He played it mechanically, focusing on hitting the right notes. He tried to empty his mind. He tried to stop thinking about the resistance, about the train, about the danger. He just wanted to survive the next 10 minutes. But as he played, he realized something was wrong. Earlier that day, Ilara had come home for just a few minutes. She hadn't told him anything, but she had pressed a piece of paper into his hand and whispered, "The plan changed. The sabotage team is moving early. Tonight, if you play, tell them the bridge is safe. But be careful. The lieutenant is watching." Julian had forgotten. The terror of being confronted had pushed the message out of his mind. But now, as he played the silly waltz, he remembered he had to send the message. The bridge was safe. The team could move, but the lieutenant was standing right next to him. If Julian changed the rhythm, if he played a discord, the lieutenant would hear it. He would surely arrest him. Julian continued to play the waltz. Asterisk. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Asterisk. He thought about the men waiting in the dark by the bridge. They were cold, scared, and waiting for his signal. If he didn't play it, they wouldn't move. They might lose their chance. He had to be braver than he had ever been. He had to hide the code in plain sight. Right in front of the enemy's face, he kept the waltz going with his left hand, the bass notes, keeping the steady rhythm. 1, 2, 3. But with his right hand, he began to weave in a high, delicate melody. It was a series of fast, quiet trills. Trill, trill, trill. It sounded like decoration. It sounded like the sparkly notes that pianists add to make a waltz sound pretty. To the lieutenant, it would just sound like flare. But in the code, a high, fast trill represented the bridge, and 3 of them in a row meant safe. He played the trills softly, blending them into the melody of the waltz. He didn't change the rhythm. He didn't break the flow. He just added the sparkles. The lieutenant was leaning over the piano, listening so hard his breathing was audible. Julian could feel the man's eyes burning into his hands. "There," the lieutenant said suddenly. "That note. That was an extra note." Julian didn't stop playing. "It is an ornament, sir," he said, his voice sounding thin. "A grace note. It is part of the music." "It serves no purpose," the lieutenant snapped. "It is beauty," Captain Kessler called out from his seat. "It makes the song nice." "Stop looking for trouble where there is none, Hans," Julian continued. He repeated the trill pattern one more time to be sure. "Trill, trill, trill. The bridge is safe." He played for another minute, making sure the waltz ended perfectly. He struck the final chord and lifted his hands. The silence in the room was heavy. He wasn't sure if he was going to be arrested or shot. Then Captain Kessler began to clap. Slowly. "Very nice," Kessler said. "See, Hans? Just music. You are too suspicious." The lieutenant let out a sound of disgust. He stomped his foot and turned away. "You are a fool, Captain," he muttered. He walked down the stage stairs and stormed out of the hall into the night. Julian sat on the bench, his shirt soaked with sweat. He realized he had been holding his breath. He let it out slowly, his whole body slumping forward. He had done it. He had tricked the suspicious officer. He had sent the message, but he also knew he had pushed his luck too far. The lieutenant was not a man who gave up easily. He would be watching Julian now. He would be listening. The game had changed. Julian wasn't invisible anymore. He was a target. He stood up slowly. His legs felt weak. He bowed to the captain even though the captain couldn't see his face properly. "Good night, Julian," Kessler said. "Same time next week?" Julian hesitated. "Yes, Captain," he lied. He walked out of the hall, but he didn't go home. He walked toward the river. He needed to know if his message had been received. He stood in the shadows of an alleyway, shivering in the cold, listening. Far off in the distance, near the bridge, he heard a low rumble. It wasn't a truck. It was an explosion. Then, seconds later, the sound of gunfire crackled through the air like dry wood snapping. Julian leaned his head against the cold brick wall. The bridge was safe. The resistance had moved. The message had gone through. He closed his eyes and whispered a silent thank you to the universe. But even as the relief washed over him, the fear remained. He knew he couldn't go back there. He had sent 50 messages, and he had sent the final warning. But the lieutenant knew something was wrong. Julian's time at the piano was running out. Asterisk the night the bridge was blown up, the city woke up. Not with joy, but with the sound of alarms. Sirens wailed from every direction, a screaming noise that tore through the walls of the apartment buildings. Julian sat on his bed, fully dressed, holding his cane so tightly his knuckles were white. He listened. The explosions had stopped, but the yelling in the streets had begun. He could hear trucks racing by, their engines roaring, tires crunching on the snow. The soldiers were angry. They were hunting. Alara burst through the door, breathless and coated in a layer of frost. She didn't even take off her coat. "We have to go," she said. Her voice was shaking. "Now, the lieutenant," Julian asked quietly. "He knows," she said. "He came to the safe house an hour ago. He tore the place apart. He was screaming about the music. He knows the messages came from the piano, Julian. He doesn't know how, but he knows you are the source. They are coming to arrest you." Julian stood up. He felt a strange sense of calm. He had known this day was coming. He had played with fire, and eventually the fire was going to burn. He walked over to the piano in the corner. He placed his hand on the cold wood. He would probably never touch this instrument again. "And where will we go?" he asked. "South," Alara said, grabbing his arm. "There is a farm. A friend of the resistance. We will hide there until the war is over." Julian nodded. He let her lead him out of the apartment. He didn't look back. He didn't need to see the room to remember it. He carried the memory of the sounds and the smells in his mind. They hurried down the stairs, keeping to the shadows. Outside, the wind was biting. It felt like the city itself was trying to push them away. They moved through the alleyways, guided by Eilir's firm grip on Julian's arm. They avoided the main roads where the military trucks were rumbling. Once, a siren blared right above them, and a beam of light swept across the alley. Ilara pulled Julian down behind a stack of wooden crates, holding her hand over his mouth. They crouched there in the freezing slush, listening to the heavy boots of soldiers running past just a few feet away. Julian's heart was hammering against his ribs, but he didn't make a sound. He had learned to be silent, after hours of walking through the dark. They reached a prearranged meeting point on the outskirts of the city. A truck was waiting there, its engine idling quietly. Rough hands helped Julian into the back, under a tarp that smelled of wet canvas and potatoes. He lay there in the dark, bumping along the rough road, leaving the only home he had ever known behind. The war didn't end that day, or that week. Julian spent the next 2 years in a small hidden room in an old farmhouse deep in the countryside. It was quiet there. The silence was heavy and empty. It was filled only with the sounds of nature, the wind in the trees, the cows lowing in the barn. The rain on the roof. It was a hard life, but it was a safe one. Julian was forbidden from playing the piano. The resistance leaders were afraid that the sound of music might travel, or that Julian's playing might be used to signal someone again by mistake. He understood the logic, but it broke his heart. For a man who saw the world through sound, living in total silence was like being buried alive. He missed the keys. He missed the vibration of the strings. He missed the feeling of creating something out of nothing. He spent his days sitting in a wooden chair, listening to the radio on low volume, waiting for news. He heard about the Allied forces advancing. He heard about cities being liberated. And then, one spring morning, the silence changed. The battery in the radio had died. Julian sat in the quiet room, fiddling with the dial. Suddenly, he heard a noise outside. It wasn't the wind. It was a church bell. Then another, and another. Bells were ringing in every village nearby, loud and chaotic. Ilara ran into the room. She was crying, but she was laughing too. She grabbed Julian's hands and spun him around. "It's over," she said. "The surrender is signed. The war is over. We won." Julian stood there. He let the words wash over him. "We won," he repeated. Time moved forward after that. The soldiers left, the cities were rebuilt, and the world tried to heal. Julian and Ilara moved back to the city. Their old apartment was gone, destroyed in the fighting. But the community hall still stood. Several years later, a ceremony was held in the main square of the city. They were unveiling a statue to honor the resistance fighters, the men and women who had died in the shadows. To free their country, Julian stood in the crowd. He was older now, his hair completely white, his face lined with wrinkles. He leaned heavily on his cane. Ilara stood beside him, holding his arm. The air smelled different now. It smelled like fresh bread and asphalt. It didn't smell like smoke and fear anymore. A dignitary stood on a platform near the old community hall. He began to read a speech. He talked about the brave soldiers who had fought on the front lines. He talked about the spies who had stolen documents. Then he lowered his voice, becoming serious. "But there were others," the dignitary said. "Fighters we may never know by name. We know that for over a year, the resistance had a source inside the German High Command. A source that sent us 50 messages in a single night. Information about troop movements, train schedules, and bridge security. This information saved hundreds, perhaps thousands of lives. We do not know who this spy was. We do not know if they survived. But we know they were a musician," the crowd murmured. Julian froze. "We know," the dignitary continued, "because the messages were hidden in the performance of a blind pianist who played for the officers. The officers thought they were being entertained. They didn't know they were hearing their own defeat. To the unknown musician, wherever you are, we thank you. You played the song of freedom." A round of applause started. It began slowly and then grew into a roar. People clapped and cheered. Tears streamed down faces in the crowd. They looked at each other, wondering who the hero was. Was it that old man in the corner? Was it the woman with the scarf? They looked for a soldier, a tough man with a gun. Nobody looked at the blind man standing quietly near the back. Holding his sister's arm, Julian felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the sun shining down. He smiled. It was a small, secret smile. He didn't need a medal. He didn't need a statue. He had his memory. He remembered the feeling of hitting the keys, the adrenaline of sending the code, and the satisfaction of outsmarting the enemy. He remembered the night he sent the 50 messages. He remembered the night he told them the bridge was safe. He had fought with the only weapon he had. He had turned his blindness into a shield and his music into a sword. "It was you," Ilara whispered, squeezing his arm. "They are talking about you." "I know," Julian whispered back. But let them keep wondering. The music was enough. As the applause faded and the band began to play a joyful, triumphant song, Julian listened. He didn't need to see the celebration. He could hear it. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't need to analyze the notes. He didn't need to count the rhythm. He didn't need to find the hidden meaning. He could just enjoy the music. He was free. The song was over, and the silence was gone.